Good morning, Broncos Country. Welcome into the first ever installment of Good Morning Broncos. We're going to do a daily digital show all throughout the entire year, giving you all the Broncos news, content coverage that you need here as well. And it's going to be designed to be in the morning. So you know what you can do? You can sit down at your chair. You can sit down on your couch. You can lay in bed if you want and watch us on YouTube. And you can drink a cup of coffee as we break down what's going on in the Valley. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, and we have a jam-packed first installment episode for you here today on the debut edition of Good Morning Broncos. What you'll get on today's show, training camp recap from Saturday's back together weekend. The intensity is starting to ramp things up, and this morning here at the Centura Health Training Center, the Broncos, they're going to throw the pads on for the first time in Sean Payton's first training camp as the team's head coach. On top of that, we'll also tell you which players that nobody knows too much about that you need to pay attention to when the pads come on. Let's get into it here as we open up today's episode of the show. Training camp does continue here this morning at the Centura Health Training Center, 10 o'clock a.m. So the clock is ticking as we get ready to be back on the practice field, watching the Broncos in their first padded practice. Every practice so far has been without pads, minimalized contact. The evaluation will now change going forward with how myself, other media members, but more importantly, how the coaches view these players that they're going to be leading up into preseason battle. Not this week, but next week will be the first preseason game against the Arizona Cardinals. And I think that positions where the pads, where they come on, are probably the most pivotal that everybody needs to keep in mind in terms of evaluation. You want to see it on your offensive line, your defensive line. Trench warfare is one of the most important elements of the game. Your offensive line, defensive line play can win and lose you games, and that is the common denominator as the Broncos have gone into this offseason in particular and have spent a lot of money adding right tackle Mike McGlinchey, adding Ben Powers from the Baltimore Ravens to help boost an offensive line. You have the return of Garrett Bowles coming off of a major leg injury from last season, and Lloyd Cushenberry enters a make-or-break year for him in the final year of his contract. Can he find solid ground and prove to the Broncos that he can be their center for years going forward? There's a lot of pressure riding on it, and you have to identify your key depth there. Defensive line-wise is how can you generate more pressure on opposing quarterbacks, not just from your edge rusher position. That doesn't get highlighted enough, but that's why we'll break it down here on Good Morning Broncos. I want to take a look at running back, though. One of the bigger things, in my opinion, that needs to happen is how do the running backs look when the pads come on? Outside of Javonte Williams and Samaje Perine, these guys are roster locks for the most part. But there is a competition for that running back 3 spot, and there's 3 backs. Jaleel McLaughlin, undrafted rookie free agent out of Youngstown State. He's the NCAA's all-time leading rusher. You have Tony Jones Jr., who has played for Sean Payton previously as a member of the New Orleans Saints. And then you also add into the mix there Tyler Beatty, who came out of nowhere a little bit last year, used to be on the Baltimore Ravens practice squad. Ravens fans were pissed when the Broncos plucked him off the practice squad. They saw something in him, and obviously there's some running back stuff going on with J.K. Dobbins, his knee. They were expecting maybe Tyler Beatty to play a little bit of a role for them, but Denver snagged him, and his first ever touch in the NFL came in that last game of the regular season last year for a touchdown against the Los Angeles Chargers and a quick pass dump off from Russell Wilson. So what we've seen so far from these guys at Broncos training camp has been explosiveness, in particular between Beatty and Jaleel McLaughlin. Now the question here is when you evaluate these guys with pads on, there's going to be a live period. Sean Payton told us on Saturday there's going to be some times where they're live, which means that there is going to be tackling. There is going to be going to the ground. You have to simulate in practice at times what you're going to get in an NFL game. And these running backs and a lot of these players, they're going to get tackled. They're going to get hit, but it's about being in a controlled environment. So for Jaleel McLaughlin, for Tyler Beatty, how do these guys manage hitting the hole? How does it manage when you have a defensive lineman who can now attack with his hands, shoot the gap, and you have blitzing linebackers, safeties filling their alleyways? How does that impact a running back with their vision? Do they protect the football still high and tight, nose secured? And more importantly, in pass protection situations, how do they uphold against pressure and against the blitz there to help provide extra security for the quarterback? These are going to be some of the things that will determine how the running back 3 competition will go. Now, while Beatty and McLaughlin have looked the most explosive, Tony Jones Jr., with his experience, he may not need that if he is consistent when the pads come on, protects the football, gets north-south, follows his blocks. Those are things that make a big difference when determining how a position will go. So running back obviously is a very, very important position to watch. I think outside linebackers, we need to keep an eye on this coming forward as well, because you look at that, you have to maintain edge discipline. That's one of the key things in today's NFL, especially in the 3-4 defense. Your outside linebackers have very high expectations on them. It's to rush the quarterback, but at the same time, you have to keep edge contained, because if the quarterback gets outside the pocket, you have an open alley for positive yards that could impact you negatively when we talk about defensive outcomes. So I think those are things that are important. And really, to kind of set the table for this morning's practice, let's take a look at our Day 4 Broncos camp practice recap video, where they were at the Centura Health Training Center for the NFL's Back Together weekend. Here's what we put together. It was Back Together weekend for the Denver Broncos as training camp continues here. Here are 3 takeaways you need to pay attention to from Saturday's practice at the Centura Health Training Center. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports. First off, let's go through the observation process here. The pads will come on next week, beginning on Monday. Now, even though the pads come on Monday, there won't be as much physicality allowed, as they will ease into the physical contact period, but practices are expected to be a little bit more intense. So when the pads come on, players you need to keep an eye on, specifically on the Broncos defensive line, PJ Mustafa, the undrafted rookie free agent out of Penn State, and Elijah Garcia, who was picked up late last year. Keep an eye on these 2 players specifically, outside of the more obvious names like Frank Clark, Zach Allen, and even DJ Jones, Randy Gregory. These are 2 guys you need to keep an eye on in the rotational mix here. Now, our second takeaway here, Damari Mathis had a chance to catch up with him after practice here for the Broncos on Saturday. Now, for him, he feels much more comfortable coming into this season. When you look at last year when he came into training camp, he was working his way through the depth chart, trying to make plays to get more noticed by the coaching staff. Well, he's emerged into a key player who they have big expectations for this upcoming season. At the cornerback position, he feels like his technique has gotten more refined in the offseason. Damari Mathis continuing to make big strides so far through Broncos training camp. And third, we talk about kickers here as well. It's always important. And in terms of a kicker competition, the kickers so far have not missed in 2 days of special teams periods for the Broncos. Brett Maher, Elliott Fry, 2 names to continue to keep an eye on. But Broncos head coach Sean Payton equated back to his story when he was in New Orleans. He had 2 kickers on his roster throughout training camp in the preseason. He ended up cutting those guys for a guy who was cut by another team in the preseason. So these guys will have to continue to be consistent all throughout training camp and preseason action, with the first one coming up here in just a week and a half, 2 weeks' time, against the Arizona Cardinals. Some other observations from practice: rookie draft pick Riley Moss, 3rd-round selection out of Iowa, made a couple of plays in special teams period. You have to equate, pads are not yet on, but at gunner he looked really good. Takes great angles and found himself downfield where he would have made a big play in a game. He's someone to keep an eye on. Aside from that, Monday's practice, the pads come on. We'll have you covered here, Mile High Sports. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter. We'll catch you next time. It was a hot one in Dove Valley on Saturday. For those of you that are watching, as you can tell, look at that little sunburn that I got there. But you know what? There's a price to be paid. There's the pound of flesh that goes into it. But kind of going back and some of those supporting points here as we get ready to get into our second topic of the show, just kind of reiterating Russell Wilson, without the pads, without I think the structure of practice has changed a little bit, and that needs to be talked about here in the eyes of fans, because what fans are looking for, if you're attending, you might see a tweet from somebody and says, okay, Russ had this throw, but here's the context of everything. Okay, the Broncos practice, the way that it is structured under Sean Payton, is that he wants high volumes of reps for everybody, not just the first team unit. The first team unit will get, let's say, in a 7-on-7 period, they'll get 6 or 7 reps. The second team will then come on after that, both offensively, defensively. They'll get 6 to 7 reps, something along those lines. Same thing with the third team units, 6 to 7 reps. And it's about getting quality reps, volumes of reps done in that period, and then going to the next period. It may be more individual, more group focus, more team period stuff. That's where we see the expansion here under Sean Payton. Part of me wonders how that may change when the pads come on this week for training camp and as they start to build up and ramp things up. Because look, hey, they have an acclimation period this week with the pads to really get to where they need to be, because then all next week, then they're in game preparation, focusing on doing what, they need to do from a foundational standpoint within their scheme, not giving away too much in the preseason, but also being ready to go out there and play a game is super important here for Payton and the Broncos. And he talked about that as well. To kind of piggyback on what I talked about earlier with Russell Wilson, here's the thing with Russ. Russ has been very efficient so far in Thursday's practice, and I would say all throughout OTAs, all throughout minicamp. Russ has been decisive with throwing the football. It's not like he holds on to it. I can tell you this, being at training camp last year, there were far too many times where Russell Wilson would get the snap, look for a guy, hold the ball too long, and would have to roll out and scramble and do a lot of things that didn't equate to regular season success in Nathaniel Hackett's scheme there. It's been an entirely different look here under Sean Payton, who utilizes a quick passing attempt approach, but then that's where the pads come in. He wants this team to have running the football built into their DNA so that they can do things like open up the passing game for Russ. But Denver became a little bit too pass happy last year, and they didn't have a consistent enough running game. Defenses, they didn't fall for it. And that's why the Broncos offense continued to struggle last year. Can they build and can they rectify that here under Sean Payton? That is a huge question. But as we continue on today's episode of Good Morning Broncos, we're going to dive into players that I think you need to keep an eye on outside of your regular names, starters or perceived role players, some under the radar names that you need to keep an eye on this week when the pads come on. We'll get to that as we continue today's episode of Good Morning Broncos. But first, let's take a look at our sponsors. I want to thank everybody for tuning in here to this morning's Good Morning Broncos, the first installment here at milehighsports.com. Also, this goes out live every morning, 9 o'clock a.m. Mountain Time on our Mile High Sports YouTube page. So make sure if you're just now stumbling upon us, hit that subscribe or that follow button so you never miss out on daily Broncos news, content coverage, and more. We also have some other great shows that will debut on the Mile High Sports YouTube page, including the Pickaxe and Roll podcast, which you've already tuned into, hosted by our NBA Nuggets reporter, Ryan Blackburn. He's covered all the pick and roll action you need pertaining to the Denver Nuggets. But let's continue today's episode of Good Morning Broncos, talking about players that I think Broncos country needs to pay attention to as we go throughout training camp here when the pads come on. The not so obvious names that we already talk about specific positions. We'll talk about the defensive line. Now, in my video recap, I kind of mentioned some names that you need to keep an eye on the defensive line, and that is undrafted rookie free agent PJ Mustipher and Elijah Garcia. Now, the Broncos have a variety of guys in that defensive line room, and one of the demands that we've seen so far from returning defensive line coach, we talk about positional versatility. What does that mean? What are you talking about, Cody? Well, here's what it means from the standpoint, from a coaching perspective, is that you can't just have guys who specialize at playing just defensive tackle. You can't have guys that just specialize at playing just defensive end. You need to have these guys be able to play a multitude of techniques. And that's how they view it on the defensive line under Marcus Dixon is, can this guy play a 3 technique, which is the outside shade of the offensive guard's shoulder? Can you play a 2-eye, which is the inside shade of the guard's shoulder? Can you play a 1, which is either side shade of the center? And can you play a little bit wide? Can you maybe play in a 5 technique, which is the outside shoulder of the offensive tackle? For those of you that don't know what that is, I try to be as verbally descriptive as possible there. But it's about being able to do all of those things, because if you can, it gives the Broncos more personnel flexibility in certain sub packages when they go to the nickel or the dime, or if they want a heavy jumbo package against teams that love to run the football. That is a key that you need to have in your back pocket there. And it's about identifying the top guys. Now, I think when you look at the defensive line, there are some valid questions about, is the depth behind them, is it going to be good enough for the regular season? I think that's a valid question, right? You lose Draymond Jones to Seattle. You lose Deshaun Williams to the Carolina Panthers. You go out and you add Zach Allen, who's been a terrific addition for them. And I think he's going to be a tremendous impact player for them on the defensive line. DJ Jones is back. Mike Purcell is on the non-football injury list, and hopefully he'll be activated from that soon. But you have some core guys there. But in the event of an injury, do you have anybody behind them that can step up and run with it? And I think that's what this whole period of training camp with the pads, next week's preseason game against the Cardinals, you're going to find out a lot about some of these players. And I think PJ Mustipher and Elijah Garcia are two guys on the defensive line that you need to pay attention to in terms of when they rotate in. What do they look like? Are they physical? Do they get off double teams? Can they anchor down and plug a hole and allow your linebackers to fill and your outside guys to crash in? These are things that I'm looking for specifically on the defensive line. But now let's take a look at a position. A couple of guys at the linebacker position. We talk about pads, physicality. We already know Alex Singleton, Josie Jewell. They both were the top two leading tacklers on the Broncos last year. There's no questions about them. But how does it look when the pads come on for Drew Sanders, who has such extreme athleticism? The Broncos' third-round pick out of Arkansas at 6'5" is rangy, dynamic, quick hips, good footwork. When they pair him alongside Jonas Griffith, who also has all the potential in the world to be a starter for another NFL team, these two guys, I want to see what they look like as a unit together against the run when the Broncos offense, whether it's the ones, twos, or threes, they try to run the football against them. How do they line up in coverage as well? Over the weekend, Drew Sanders had a pretty good play in 7-on-7 in coverage on tight end Greg Dulcich, getting on his hip, getting his ball side hand across, knocking the football away. That's what you can add to the table here. And if these guys shine, stay healthy, Denver's got a really, really good backcourt depth at the linebacker spot of 4 guys. And then you're going to have a 5th guy, obviously, in Justin Sternad, who will play a pivotal role on special teams. But we'll see how that linebacker room shakes out. And there's so many different personnel moves that will be made. And you might have to rob Paul to pay Peter. You might have to have more guys at one position, and that impacts your ability to keep guys at another, even if that player is good there. Running back, this is probably very, very important. So we're kind of going back to what I talked about in terms of physicality between Jaleel McLaughlin, Tyler Beatty, run the football in between the tackles, ball security, catching the ball out of the backfield. How do these guys stack up when the defense sends pressure, which I think we'll see a lot of that in the first couple of practices when the pads come on, some of the live periods there, because Russell Wilson and this Broncos offense under Sean Payton's design, Sean Payton wants to test them. He wants to see where they're at in this department because Denver last year gave up 63 total sacks. A lot of that pressure came on the interior, some on the outside. A lot of it miscommunication, just simply getting beaten by the other guy. Denver has to find a sense of pride in the offensive line, and they will be tested. And Sean Payton will tell Vance Joseph to throw the sink at them because they have to find a way to overcome that hurdle which got in their way last year. We already talked about other players like Nik Bonitto, Marcus Haynes. I think at the tight end position as well, Chris Manhertz, obviously 6'4" size for him. He's a physical guy, 24 career catches in 7 years. It goes to show it's in his DNA that he's a really good blocker. Sean Payton raved about that the other day as well as they had practice on Saturday. He told us in his post-practice press conference. But looking at Adam Troutman, a former third-round pick for the New Orleans Saints when Sean Payton was there, Denver traded for him in this year's NFL draft with the Saints, and he's coming over to fit in the mix. Whereas you look at guys like Greg Dulcich, probably a top receiving threat at the tight end position. We talk about the Joker role, Albert O, a receiving threat here. But can these guys showcase a little bit more when the pads come on? Because Sean Payton made a great point. When you have a really good tight end who can block, who's athletic, big, and physical, it alleviates your need to have an extra offensive lineman. And there were times last year where Denver had to put 2 offensive tackles on the field in general. Well, I mean, let me catch myself there. You already have 2 offensive tackles, but adding an extra offensive tackle to the field on one side because Denver simply struggled against some of the NFL's premier strength pass rushers, defensive ends, you name it. Denver struggled against it last year. And now you have a guy who's athletic enough that he can maybe be a little bit of a deterrent for a guy. He can help out against guys like Max Crosby, Chris Jones, Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack inside the AFC West. Denver's going to have to play Von Miller this year. So how do you negate that? You don't want to leave any offensive tackle in one-on-one situations where it doesn't benefit them. You add a guy who's big physical like Manhertz. There's a reason he's made it in the NFL for 7 years now, going into his 8th season, despite only having 24 career catches. means he's a pretty damn good blocker, and he's physical. That's what Denver needs going forward here. But there was a new addition to the Denver Broncos on this roster this offseason during the end of OTAs and minicamp, and that is outside linebacker Frank Clark, coming over from the Kansas City Chiefs, signing a one-year deal. It's a low-risk, high-reward type of move for the Denver Broncos. Jones is a Super Bowl champion. He's won it twice with the Kansas City Chiefs. They could have won a third one. He had some spicy comments overall in his first introductory press conference here with the Denver Broncos following Saturday's back-to-football practice in front of all the fans at the Centura Health Training Center. Here's what Frank Clark had to say about the Broncos and Kansas City Chiefs and whether or not it's a rivalry.
I wouldn't call it a rivalry, and a rivalry is competitive. True or false? And I'm on the Broncos now, and I've been on the other side. You know what I mean? And we didn't call it a rivalry then. I'm with the Broncos now. Until we become competitive enough, we have to beat the team. We have to win our division. We have to do a few things, not just about the Chiefs. It's things we have to do here. We got to get our own ball together here in order for us to go out there and compete, for us to become one of those factions.
He said what? I think a lot of people, some people have taken offense to what he said, which I'm sitting here as someone who's covered the team, and I talk with a lot of Broncos fans all the time, and it's interesting to hear the different perspectives from fans. But I don't feel like Frank Clark was wrong with what he said, right? You talk about a rivalry, and he said it best, true or false, like a rivalry is competitive. We look at this over the course of history for Denver. There were times where Denver ran through the entire AFC West, right? And you wouldn't necessarily call those games a rivalry. A rivalry, I think, is more of the sense that, hey, it is competitive. Like you're trading barbs. You may split the season series 1-1 each season. Denver has not beaten Kansas City 15 straight games. So it isn't much of a rivalry right now, but Frank Clark gave a little bit of a bigger picture to it. It's not just about beating the Kansas City Chiefs. It's about taking care of business as a football team, because you have more than just your division you have to take care of. You have to take care of other games. There's other teams inside your own division that you must find a way to stop. The Broncos have struggled to find a way to beat the Raiders in the last few years. The Chargers, they've always kind of had this 1-1 season series split. They've kind of kept things close there. But aside from that, like a rivalry needs to be something that you look forward to, that, hey, this is a primetime football. Anytime these two teams play, it's one that you qualify as, hey, this needs to be on primetime. We have to see what happens here. Kansas City is very talented, and they've had the Broncos number. And Frank Clark has been a thorn in the Broncos side for quite some time. Heck, even last year, in that last game they played at Arrowhead Stadium, Frank Clark suplexed Russell Wilson on a fourth down play, which should have been called a penalty. I wonder if they talk about that in the locker room. But Frank Clark has played with Russell Wilson before and has always supported Russ and has played, and he knows what type of leader he is. And coming into this year, that was one of the reasons. Like Sean Payton and the Broncos, Frank Clark said the Broncos, they showed him love. Like they already had an offer on the table for him. And for him, that's what it's all about as a player. It's about being valued and being wanted in a sense. He signed a one-year deal with the Broncos, but now he also gets to reunite with one of his former teammates, Russell Wilson. Here's what he had to say.
Mentality, he's still dangerous. You know what I'm saying? He's still dangerous. Like, don't get it twisted at the end of the day. Players are going to age. The skill is going to fall back sometimes. I'm not saying that's happening to Russ. I'm not saying that's happening to nobody who gets older with age. I'm just saying you got to understand, Russ is a veteran. He's a guy who's won on multiple levels. He's been a part of successful teams. He's been a part of teams that's not successful. I was part of Seahawks teams that when we were successful, I was a part of teams where we didn't make the playoffs. You know what I'm saying? But it was the same Russ. So don't think Russ changes. Don't think, a few years go by, a bad season is going to shake a guy. No, bro. We start fresh every year. Every summer it's a fresh start.
That's probably one of the more important messages you can take away from that because, yeah, Russell Wilson didn't play his best football in 2022. He's been a top 10 quarterback in the NFL since he's come into the league with a chip on his shoulder. I remember specifically when Russ was a rookie, when the Seahawks played the Broncos in the preseason. I remember watching and thinking, man, hey, this guy's pretty dang good. They just signed Matt Flynn for this mega contract. I'm like, this Russell Wilson guy, he's pretty good. He's got a chip on his shoulder. If he doesn't make it with the Seahawks, some other team's going to pick him up. Surely the Seahawks said, hey, this is our guy. And look, Russ led them to multiple playoffs. They've won divisions there. They won a Super Bowl. And I think there was a lot of people out there like, well, he was carried by the defense. you don't get to the Super Bowl by being carried by your defense just alone. You have to have some realms of your offense that are impactful, and that is exactly what happened. They had a good running game. They had Marshawn Lynch. They had Russell Wilson threading the needle to guys like Golden Tate, even Doug Baldwin at times. I remember watching these games, and that Super Bowl 48 blowout was a great example. Russ played some of his best football throwing on the run and negating some of the things that the Broncos did really well or could have done to maybe try to impact them a little bit in that game. But obviously, Russ had a really bad season last year. The narrative in the national media has changed on him. A lot of people close to him, including Sean Payton, think that's BS. And we're fixing to find out exactly if Sean Payton can help put Russell Wilson and his teammates in a position where they turn it around this upcoming season. Well, Broncos Country, that'll do it for today's episode of Good Morning Broncos. We'll be here with you on YouTube, Mile High Sports, every single morning at 9 o'clock a.m. Mountain Time. So make sure you brew a pot of coffee, you sit down, you catch us on your phone on YouTube, your smart TV, or even your computer as we break down things with the storylines. I've got to head to practice as the Broncos throw on the pads here today at the Centura Health Training Center. 10 a.m. Mountain Time. Practice is going to begin. If you're out there, make sure you come find me. Come say hi. I would love to interact with you as well in person. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow with a brand new Good Morning Broncos.